It is my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Thea Renda Abu El-Haj, esteemed professor here at Rutgers GSC and anthropologist of education. Thea's research explores new questions about youth citizenship raised by globalization, transnational migration, and the war on terror. This ethnographic research focuses on how young Palestinian Americans and other Arab Americans grapple with questions of belonging and citizenship in the wake of September 11th, 2001. Thea has a book recently out from Chicago Press entitled Unsettled Belonging: Educating Palestinian American Youth After 9/11. Other publications that have come out of this body of work have appeared in Anthropology and Education Quarterly, Harvard Educational Review, Educational Policy, and Theory into Practice. Her first book, Elusive Justice: Wrestling with Difference in Educational Equity in Everyday Practice, came out in 2006 and offers a critical account of the range of justice claims at play inside real schools, exploring several different important dimensions of educational equity that are often ignored in contemporary educational policy debates. Please welcome Thea.
I've been told that I should have these when I talked about my book, so if anybody's interested, gets really interested, there's some more information at the back. So thanks everyone for coming out. I feel like I'm standing upright this week, which is good. Sorry about canceling last week. Glad to be back on campus. People have been saying, where are you? We haven't seen you. I was on sabbatical, which was nice. And I want to talk. I'm going to talk today about my book, and I'm going to sort of, in a way, race you through like a much bigger argument. You can tell me how well that works later, because I am condensing a huge ethnography into a short talk. And I want to start by telling you two stories that capture kind of the central conflict I'm trying to get at in my book. So the school I did my work, where most of the youth I worked with were, I call regional high. On September 11th, 2001, a young woman I call Khalida Saba was it was her first day at school. So it wasn't an ordinary day. It was her first day of her freshman year in high school. She had recently come back from Palestine with her mother and her siblings, and it was sort of as a result that she and her sisters were starting a few days late. So it was their first day, although it wasn't the first day of the school year. She was born in the U.S., but grew up mostly in Palestine as part of a strategy that many people in her community, or what I call a transnational strategy that many families in the community had, which was that kids are U.S. citizens, but they really wanted their children to grow up with a cultural, linguistic, and political education. And so mothers and their children moved back to Palestine. And this was also, after the 1990 Oslo Accords, when there was a lot of optimism among Palestinians that there would be an independent state soon. But what happened for those families is that after the Second Intifada started in 2000, the ordinarily quite repressive strategies of the occupation got worse. And among the first things that got even more difficult was schools. So it was education. So there was more and more school closings. And folks who could come back many of them decided to bring their kids back to the U.S. where they could get an education. So here's Khalida back in the States after 7 years, and her first day is 9/11. She was pretty used to what it had meant. She remembered clearly what it meant to transition to a new school when she talked about when she went to Palestine as a 7-year-old, what it was like to be like the new kid who didn't know everything and how difficult it was. But really nothing could have prepared her for what happened in the U.S. in the sort of years following 9/11, and the ways that 9/11 would really follow the Palestinian and other Arab kids in the school over the course of their schooling. So that same day, the principal of this huge city high school was trying to close down the school. So across the Northeast, I don't know if folks remember this, but a lot of high schools were, a lot of school districts closed that day and tried to get everyone home. There was chaos. People didn't know what was going on. And as he's in the midst of trying to close down the school, he told me that a teacher marched into his office this and demanded that he round up all the Palestinian kids. And he told me, you know, I said to him, like, what, do you want me to put a target on their back too? But my point, and the reason I start with that, is to sort of remind us that even before we knew anything about what had happened on, what was happening on 9/11, who was on the planes, that it was, you know, that they were purposeful attacks, and also reminding you that there were no Palestinians at all involved in those attacks. The kids the Palestinian kids were already marked out as different, and that's part of my larger argument that racializations of Arabs and Muslims didn't start on 9/11. They were it was part of an ongoing kind of legacy here, and it has grown since then. So what I'm trying to do in my book and my work is really think about how at the heart of both these stories are disjunctures between different notions of citizenship. The one expressed by the teacher is an exclusionary definition, and it delimits belonging along what are ever shifting boundaries of what Benedict Anderson has called an imagined national community, right? So we aren't just born Americans or Egyptians or whatever. The definition of who belongs to a community and who doesn't, and who's allowed to be part of that is constantly being constructed. And those imaginings of who can and cannot be a member actually are not only figurative, but also regulate the debates about who's allowed into the country legally, right, and physically. So, and it's a definition then that hitches citizenship rights, the rights of citizenship, to belonging in the imagined community. It's a definition that for Palestinian Americans and other marginalized communities, especially marginalized people of color, sets nearly impossible conditions for belonging. And those conditions include the abandonment of cultural, political, linguistic, and religious ties. And this is a definition that has the power of nation states behind it, right? So nation states regulate. I also want to remind you what happened in the aftermath of 9/11, which is that immediately lots of people who were either Muslim or were presumed to be Muslim were immediately detained and put into into centers without rights. So you get how belonging is tied to rights. Now, the other definition of citizenship is one that's enacted by members of the Palestinian American community and many, many other migrant communities across the world. It's a definition that's forged within transnational communities, and it's one that unhinges a sense of national belonging to rights of citizenship. The Palestinian American youth and their families simultaneously felt that they were part of a Palestinian national community and that they were US citizens. So citizenship in this sense is a practice through which people leverage rights to economic, social, political, and cultural resources. And when you uncouple citizenship from national belonging, we are reflecting a kind of ideal of post-nationalist citizenship that a lot of political scientists and sociologists have been sort of talking about. We might aspire to a world in which our citizenship isn't hitched to rights, but it's also a fact on the ground. That globalization and global migration is meaning that more and more people are moving in order to attain rights that they don't necessarily have access to in different places. And in some ways, it's a kind of lived experience of what the philosopher Margaret Summers has defined. She defines citizenship as the right to have rights. Okay, so that's one of the things I'm trying to work on. Another is that I've really been focusing for the past decade on the relationship between education and citizenship. So examining this tension between the lived experiences of transnational belonging and citizenship forged by the Palestinian Americans with whom I worked, and those embodied by state policies and reflected in nationalist discourses that they encountered in their schools. So I'm trying to understand how those tensions between those different visions of citizenship shaped young people's educational experiences that for them were racialized exclusions. But I'm also looking at how in the midst of these kind of racialized exclusions, how are Palestinian American youth actually creating transnational or living out transnational citizenship practices and making bids for citizenship rights and inclusion in their school and outside of their schools. So as an anthropologist, I take citizenship to be a lived practice, not just to be the passport that you carry around, and a lived practice of how people carve out a space for themselves in the political, cultural, and social lives of their communities, of their countries, and that might not just be one nation state. Okay? And within this sense of how people like Marshall, who have theorized citizenship, have talked about citizenship rights evolving over time. So early citizenship rights had to do with political rights, and over time you get a development of the notion of citizenship to include civil and human rights, and also what Marshall calls social rights, like the right to education, right to welfare, the things that allow you to be a full participant in your society. Because if you're not educated, if you're ill, if you don't have housing, it's hard to exercise it to its fullest the rights of citizenship. Okay, so the other thing I'm trying to do, I lost you yet? I'm going to go really fast because it's a big book. Okay, so one of the things I've been trying to do is really reframe some of the way our approaches to immigrant education, to understanding it. And first, it's by really developing an account of the ways that schools are actually sites that produce nationalism, and are places where we're not just negotiating, our kid's going to be academically successful or not. We're also teaching folks about what we consider what does it mean to become assimilated into the U.S. And we are actually producing racialized exclusions through those ways of negotiating what it means to belong or not belong. My case is about Palestinian Americans. There's lots of other communities we could do the same work on. In fact, we have Ariana sitting right here who does lovely work on these questions about citizenship. School as a site that's producing both educational achievement and citizenship in the same kind of space. And I really pay attention to the ways that discourses of American nationalism are very much tied up with the United States' role as an imperial power right now. Does not make me very popular in a lot of venues, but I think we have to really understand the logics of sort of the sense of the nation as a benevolent force in the world, and how that constructs exclusions for particular kids inside our schools. But the other thing I'm trying to do is, again, look at youth citizenship. So in the immediately after 9/11, a lot of people sort of were like, oh my God, we don't know anything about Muslim youth in American schools. So there's a whole, not a whole bunch, but there are a few studies kind of looking at this question. And most of them really focus on questions of identity, which we do a lot of our work around questions of identity. So to what extent do Muslim American youth feel Muslim or feel American? We can talk later about why I think that's deeply problematic in terms of it. As an anthropologist, I don't think that there is this Muslim thing that's culture over here, an American thing that's culture over here, and kids are going in between. There are ways that people are experiencing that and interpreting that, and that's one of the things I try to pay attention to. So I'm trying to really shift from a focus on identity to a focus on citizenship as lived practice, right? To how are young people making sense of and navigating and creating a space for themselves as political actors in the world. And a lot of that work is done through what people talk about as the culture of as the politics of culture. So culture gets leveraged in particular ways on all sides of this debate, and we'll look at how that happens in a few minutes. Okay, so that was a mouthful of theory, which we can talk about more. I'm going to try to make this concrete today by focusing on two young people mostly, who I call Samira and Adam. And I want to really explore this idea that belonging is a thicker concept than citizenship. And it's got an affective dimension to it. And then I want to show how their right to belong in schools and in society was challenged kind of like on the ground every day through patriotic, nationalist, and imperialist discourses that read Arab and Muslim youth through popular political discourses about a clash of civilizations between the liberal West and the conservative fundamentalist, Muslim world, which is an imagined place. There's no Muslim world. Leila Abu-Lubad has done some really good work on that, as has Mahmoud Namdani. So I look closely at kind of everyday talk and practice that renders Samira, Adam, and their peers as what Guy has called impossible subjects of the US. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the kinds of bids for citizenship that they make. Like, how are they making claims for belonging and inclusion? I'm also, for the sake of time, going to say very little about methods, but I did do a longitudinal multi-site study of Arab American youth in the post-9/11 context, and then this book is really focused on kind of a smaller group within that larger study of Palestinian American youth. I position myself in that work as an activist and critical ethnographer. So I actually started the work in the school that I talk about by co-founding an after-school club for Arab American youth. And actually what ended up happening was only Palestinian American youth. Most of the Arabs in that school were Palestinians, and that sort of became the Palestinian American after-school club. And I did collaborative work with an Arab American community arts organization that was formed after 9/11 to really support leadership and other kinds of activities in the area. And out of that after-school work, so we did a lot of work with young people around film and using the arts as ways to sort of create counter narratives to what they were facing about their communities. And then as I got to know young people over a couple years, I invited them to become part of this study and did a lot of interviews, and then chose 4 focal students that I tracked through their school days. So lots of years. You can't walk into a community under surveillance, even though I'm Palestinian. This particular community is not my particular, I'm not a family member in that community. You can't walk into a community under surveillance and say, hi, I'm a friendly researcher, can I do some research here? It had to be kind of out of a more organic and activist commitment, because for rightful reasons, they were would be highly suspicious people. Okay, so just a few things about the research context. So I define this community as transnational for several reasons. Not only because folks moved back and forth, which they did, which is important. So many transnational communities are actually physically moving places, but also to reference the ways that many young people live, even if they never leave the neighborhood that they are born in. They are living more and more in transnational social fields. They're interacting with media from other places. They're talking to family members constantly. There's money being sent back and forth. So more and more, our lives are not really lived just locally. So that's true of this community. All of the young people I worked with were US citizens, born here, even if they then went back. And as I said earlier, most of them actually returned and spent many years in Palestine during our optimistic phase. And migration was for both reasons, which are tied up together. The Israeli occupation of Palestine makes the political situation very difficult, but it also makes the economic situation very difficult for people. And the majority of folks that I worked with were concentrated in this one high school, but I also decided, after working for several years with young people at this high school, to do a broader set of life history narratives with other Palestinian Americans in the area for a couple of reasons. One was that most of the young people I worked with were tracked into the low tracks of the school, And even though it was a school that had AP and a magnet program, they weren't in that. There was only one young woman who was in that program, and she didn't want to be a vocal student. So most of the young people I worked with did not go on to either 2- or 4-year colleges. A couple went to, Samira went to a community college and eventually graduated as an elementary school teacher, but most didn't. So part of the larger picture was to look at young people who graduated from other high schools in the area to get sort of a sense of what was the temperature across the city, and also folks who'd gone on to 4-year colleges, because I didn't want to have just a kind of like very narrow view of the kinds of experiences that they had. Okay, so all right, so let's look at Samira. So Samira is one of the few students who had never left the States. She didn't visit Palestine until she graduated from high school. But when you ask Palestine, so how do people get that kind of sense? Now, one could say that that's fairly typical, that young people from immigrant families talk about themselves as being the place that their parents are from, which I think is partly true, but I think the question is, how do we construct a sense of belonging to that place? Why? Why does that happen, right? And for Palestinians, I think there's a very particular reason, which has to do with the lack of a nation state and the ongoing struggle for a free and independent state. And there also there's anchors between the sense of being Palestinian and being from Palestine to a couple key things. One is land. So again and again, that theme of like land and place comes up. My ancestors grew up there, my grandparents grew up there, my father has land there, and my father's land is sooner or later going to become my brother's land, right? So you have a tethering to the land. And this is true. I mean, anybody who knows anything about the Palestinian diaspora knows that folks will tell you the town they're from, even if that town has been destroyed by the Israelis and isn't still there. Folks still have, I met people I was doing work in some of the refugee camps in Lebanon, and every single person doing a kind of where I'm from poem starts with where they're from. They often have keys to the houses that they're after their grandparents left or their great-grandparents left. So there's really a sense of kind of connection to a place. And so the other thing is a sense of connection to suffering, right? This is a community that is still struggling to have an independent state. So Samira talks about the people in Palestine. When I think about the people in Palestine, and I see on TV what happens, you know, all of these Palestinians and kids are dying and everybody, I don't know, when I think about them, I feel so sorry for them. I just want to become a Palestinian so bad. And even though I am, I don't consider myself to be as one of those Palestinians who's sitting there throwing rocks at Israelis and trying to fight for the country. They're fighting for our land. So there's this, the reason I'm showing this to you is that this is what we mean by the politics of culture, right here, right? That students are actually in conversation with their families, with each other, about where's my place? How can I claim this kind of identity? And there were some very heated conversations among young people about, do I have a right to sit here in the United States and go to the shopping mall and buy shoes when my family and my community is struggling back home? How do I, you know, to what extent can I be Palestinian if I'm not there actually in the midst of the struggle? So there's a constant production of people's identities, and I would say this is true wherever we start talking about identity, there's a production, that the sense of one's identity is situated and produced in context. But suffering is certainly a key marker of what it means to be Palestinian. Now, Adam is one of the young people who did spend most of his childhood and adolescence in Palestine. And when you ask him, he says, I'm an Arab, Palestinian Arab. I got American citizenship. I was born here, but my home is not here. And one of the things I want you to pay attention to here is this sense of, again, a difference between a sense of belonging and a sense of citizenship. And citizenship is something that you acquire as a right, right? It has that sense of being a possession that he's carrying. His first language was Arabic. He worked, this was true of all of the young people. They spent most of their time with other family members and members of the sort of local, the community, like the village community that they'd come from. He worked in his father's store after school. So there's a constant kind of being in contact with other Palestinians, right? And they were very close to, you know, I started my research before Facebook, really before kind of Skype, but there were still phone calls. The girls would tell me, you know, if I do anything, like my relatives back home hear this within, you know, a day, right? So there's very much part of like producing a sense of belonging to a community that takes work, and that work is ongoing every day. And you know, he talks about living back home. So the Blad is the homeland. It's different if I lived here. Like, let's say I was here, I was born here from 1 month. I won't speak Arabic. I won't be able to say Assalamu alaikum. It's going to be hard for me. But when I was 7, my dad said, that's it, we have to take him back home. And I started thinking, like, he's going to be here working and sending money and coming to visit 3 months a year. He stays away from my mom for 9 months. It's hard. But my dad and my mom, they tell us they want us to be like, my dad has always told me, I want you to be better than me. Look at me, I'm working in the store, I'm working in the deli. I want you to go to college. I don't want you to come and be like me. So again, the sense of what families sacrifice in order to create a better life and a set of kind of rights for young people. Unfortunately, Adam was one of the many boys who didn't go to college for lots of reasons that we can talk about. So this sense of back home of the Balad was really, you know, constantly being like was a touchstone for people. This is an image of, we did a kind of identity, like this was the first art thing we did in our after school project where each student was got a tile to represent their identity. And you can see right away, this says Palestinian right in the middle, right? And then, oops, sorry, I forgot. Don't touch this. Things happen. But there are flags. There's just, again, lots and lots of markers of being Palestinian. Kids wore maps of historic Palestine on jewelry. They wore, you know, flags on their backpacks and other places. The keffiyeh, the black and white checkered scarf that has become a symbol of the Palestinian resistance movement, was a constant source of fight in the school about whether they were allowed to wear it or not. So folks are literally, like figuratively carrying the nation on their body, and they're also in constant conversation with family, with the media, with you know, peaceful demonstrations. Families house kids who've been wounded through the violence of the occupation. Many families would house kids who come here for medical treatment. So there's a real connection. So all of that said, that people are producing a sense of what it means to be Palestinian, it's still, there's a lot of complexity to kind of how are we understand the relationship between being Palestinian and being American. So Adam talks about, I know I'm an Arabi, I won't consider myself that I'm American, but I'm already here. What am I doing if I'm not American? That's how you get it. I'm here working, going to school, doing my job. That's what, but I could be American, but I won't like to be. But now we're here. So you see this through a lot of people's talk, like kids really trying to figure out what's my place. And for other students claiming more of a direct connection to being American. I'm American and I'm Palestinian. And I think there's also developmental issues. So again, I feature these two students because they're two of my focal students. But if you look, when I look at the interviews of students who are now in college, there's like often more of a claim to also their American citizenship. So I think that kind of longitudinal piece is important too. That you know, with this is adolescents at a time where they're talking about being adolescents. And here's Samira talking about why they're here, right? So there's a big reason why my family and me are here. We're living here and we're supporting those in Palestine. I have relatives who live there, and my dad is working here, and he's taking money and sending it back to Palestine in order for them to pay their bills or get food or clothes and everything else. So over here, I feel it's our duty to work and, you know, to help out. And I think, again, one of the important things to pay attention to as people are sort of enacting living transnational citizenship is that they're also changing the sense of what it means to, what duty means, right? So this is duty that looks really different than the kind of duties that they're taught in civic education classes. And I think it's also, you know, I'd like to kind of have enter a conversation here that speaks back to the kind of conservative talk about anchor babies, right? That people are coming here, and teachers would talk about this too. It's like this very, like this anger at what they see as a utilitarian use of American citizenship. But I think it's a much broader issue about the ways that people have very different access to rights by virtue of the kind of completely random event of where you're born, right? And that in our times, people are really trying to figure out how do I mean, these are folks who are thinking like, how do I maximize well-being for as many people as possible, right? And if that means I'm here and working, that is what I'm doing. Okay. The other thing for those of you, because there are a few people in here who read and think about citizenship rights. So Iowa Ong's work on flexible citizenship, she's talked about the ways that she wrote this book called Flexible Citizenship that looks at the ways that high-earning Chinese transnationals use multiple citizenship and movement as a way to kind of gain economic access and power. And this is a kind of flexible citizenship from the bottom up, right? So these are not folks who have incredible access to wealth, and I just want to make that distinction that that flexible citizenship has a lot of different kinds of forms that sometimes come from the bottom. Okay, so the other thing that I found in my work is that it's the rights-bearing citizenship of the U.S. that serves as a reference point for many young people about what citizenship rights should look like. So even though this is a community that was really aware post 9/11 and fearful of the ways that their rights as a community could be abrogated in times of war, and in fact, we can talk about this later if you want, but Adam's family had the Secret Service show up at his door, just tear the place apart for something that happened in school in a very unwarranted way. But even with that, many of them have grown up with a sense of what it means to actually have rights. And when they went to Palestine and were encountering the military occupation, was the moment where they were like, okay, whoa, this is a different sort of sense of rights. So Samira went, as I told you, for the first time, she went back after she graduated from high school. And she doesn't, I'm not going to show you this because it's like probably pages and pages and quotes, but the first thing that happened to her was she was detained for 9 hours in the Tel Aviv airport. And she was terrified, I mean, absolutely terrified. And surrounded by other Palestinians, I heard someone recently refer to this as our VIP room, but there's a separate space in the Tel Aviv airport for Palestinians. I've spent way too many hours in there myself. But there were other Palestinians there who were sort of saying to her, this is normal, don't show them that you're scared. And she was like, this isn't normal for me, right? So that sense that like she had grown up with some large sense of security and guarantee of certain kinds of due process that suddenly was not going to be flying there. And she tells this story about how me and my mom at one point decided to go and visit Jerusalem. And from what I knew, if you're an American citizen, you're allowed to go wherever you want. But it was bullshit. We got in the car. There was a couple of other people with us in the car, but they weren't Americans. And as we were leaving the village, there was a checkpoint, and they asked for everyone's ID. So me and my mom pulled out our passports, right? Like, here's our U.S. passport. It's going to do us good. And the guy said, everybody's allowed to go. 2 American passports, go back. So confronting for the first time, and another young man who went there for a couple of years, actually before the second Intifada, talks about how there was a curfew, and he was like, I'm going to the store. And his mom's like, you can't go out. And he's like, well, what do you mean I can't go out? Like, we have rights. And she's like, honey, those rights do not travel. So sort of this sense of like how people are getting that. She actually went after this and confronted the soldiers. I mean, it's like this unbelievable story because her mom and the other people in the car are like, look, you go talk to them, you go talk to them. So she walks out and like puts her hands in the air. I mean, she could have been killed. It's just like actually remarkable, but she negotiated, like by speaking in English and doing other things, she eventually negotiated them to be able to go through, but it was a very risky proposition. But my point here is that sense of rights is also an embodied sense, right? So when she's in the airport, she talks about how she felt like her heart was smaller than a mouse's heart, right? That we do wear our sense of citizenship, and you can see this if you've been to any airport where somebody has challenged an American's right to do anything, right? I mean, I remember years ago in the Greek airport, my sister and I being like this, like trying to hide our U.S. passports, where this person was furious that they were not going to accept his American driver's license to do some transaction. And the people are like, we need your passport. Guys has a driver's license from the United States, and why can't I? I mean, we're like, doesn't really travel here, folks, you know? So that sense of it's embodied. It's a lived experience. Okay. So again, I think it's clear what I'm saying is what I'm pointing to here is the way that people are developing a sense of citizenship. And another young woman in the study who was the daughter of refugee status Palestinian parents who eventually were able, you know, one at a time to bring her nuclear family here. She talks about how, and my mom still taught us that we were stateless, but like we had rights. So that sense of an aspiration, rights. But largely what I'm sort of looking at in looking at the community is thinking about how this is an informal citizenship education, right? So young people are getting an education about what it means to be citizens and to have rights in their communities through their travel in relationship to this transnational community. That is very different than formal citizenship education programs, but that's also very different than the kind of citizenship education they're getting in schools. And that's what I'm turning my attention to now. So as I mentioned before, and we all know, rights in the post 9/11 context were very much constrained, particularly for Muslim and Arab and Muslim communities. Those are not coterminous. We can talk about why I use that and what I mean by that. But folks are hyper aware of state-directed policies like the USA's Patriot Act, the detentions without cause, and the extraordinary rendition program. You know, that's very live and well if you are a member of an Arab American or a Muslim community right now. But also there were actually everyday effects of these kind of state policies and the racialization of this community that are felt through harassment, regulation of their expressive speech, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and you know, just generally a climate of fear. So Adam said to me very early in this work, you know, maybe they're going to kick all Arabs from America one day. And there was also a live conversation about the internment of Japanese and this question of like, is that going to happen to us? And the sense that could be possible, right? So that's the kind of climate that we're living in. But and the way and the kind of official state policies and the everyday racist and xenophobic acts that deny rights to some groups of people are made possible through discursive practices that are constructing self and other, insider and outsider, right? State policies on the war on terror have been bolstered by discourses about Islam that then filter down into everyday interactions, and that's what we're going to look at together. And these discourses are developed, I mean, of course, Said's classic Orientalism looks at the ways that centuries of encounter between the so-called West and the so-called Orient produce knowledge and knowledge about, you know, a kind of knowledge about what it means, what the Orient is, and how we're different than the Orient, but are also producing power in its wake. So he's, you know, looking at Foucault's idea of the ways that knowledge and power are produced together. And the thesis is really arguing that there's a fundamental difference between the development of liberal, democratic, pluralist, and tolerant values of the West and anti-democratic, anti-liberal, patriotic, intolerant, and violent tendencies that get attributed to Islam and to Arabs, and to Palestinians in particular, I would say, in the US. So I'm going to look at how these ideas about American tolerance. Wendy Brown has done some brilliant work on looking at tolerance as discourse as a political discourse that manages diversity within the US, and that post 9/11 works as a civilizational discourse to justify actions in other parts of the world. So we are tolerant, they are not tolerant. The only thing that we can't tolerate is intolerance. So therefore, we can do X and Y. And I'm going to show you how that happens, that actually those things come into everyday practice in schools. And the key to this also is a gendered assumption. These are the Muslim world is imagined in particular ways, and those imaginations are deeply gendered. And part of that is that, you know, Muslim women are oppressed, and that Muslim men are oppressing, and that there's deeply a culture of violence in those places, which again is going to come into how people interact with kids in schools. The principal at the school told me early on when we started this after-school club how thrilled he was that we were doing this because we would give girls voice. I mean, he said that same quote to me many times. And I imagine that many of you can imagine that there was no question of giving girls anything in that resembling voice in there, that folks had a pretty strong voice from the get-go. All right, so, okay, so here's just a representative sense of how a teacher thought about, you know, Muslim women. You know, they're viewed as male property. You know, the whole covering of their hair. And I know there are other reasons for that, but it can come down to that. There's some kind of special defined way that a woman is supposed to be. And I know that some would choose this and say it's very freeing. This is what I want you to pay attention to, highlighted. But it rankles me, and I guess it's because I'm born an American. And it just bothers me that somebody's taught to cover up. I respect somebody's desire to do that as long as they're really choosing it. It's just that I like the freedom to be who I want to be, and I guess I feel everyone should have that right. Everyone should have that right. So the reason I'm pointing to that is that this is the way these discourses come into the school. That folks make the assumption that liberalism and freedom from oppression are intimately American characteristics, right? Because she's born an American that she gets rankles at this site. And that even though she's got this, like, maybe some people are really choosing to wear a hijab, she doesn't really believe that, right? And again, you see that construction. So part of what I'm trying to do in this book also is to point to the ways that we can recognize Donald Trump's discourses about Muslims as being deeply racist and problematic. It's often harder for us to recognize the kind of benevolent nationalism, the construction of ourselves as a good nation whose real values, like, he does not represent our real values. The real values are liberal, are tolerant, are freedom, and that if we just got back to those, we wouldn't have this problem. And what I'm actually showing in the book is that, in fact, those nice values are used to racialize folks. And this happens across, I mean, Arabs are not the only group for whom this is true. Okay, and then the other one, so there's this sort of sense of, you know, if women are oppressed, the boys are violent and intolerant. There was often an aggressive posture by the Middle East men, particularly the Palestinian kids. And I'm actually talking about boys here, but. Now, I don't know if that had to do with the fact that they were raised where they were raised, and they're coming here, and they may have had preconceived notions as it relates towards Americans. I always felt it was aggressive and kind of irreverent. Like, so you've got this kind of like, it's over there. Over there, there's this hostility towards America, and they're bringing it with them. No sense that there could be any legitimate claims of. But here's what then happens is that the ideal is that an American education is going to make them into tolerant, liberal subjects of it. I've come to understand that maybe if they viewed Americans as the enemy, if that's what was basically professed where they were, then they come here, and having lived here for X number of years, I've definitely seen an assimilation. For example, Amir Khalid, he was a Lebanese kid, was an angry, angry man when he came. You know, he drew pictures of planes and bombs and guns and all kinds of stuff. I worked closely with him. I saw little by little he was venturing out from his group, and he was involved in the Asian Club. It was Asian breakdancers. It looked like breakdancing, and they were Asian kids plus Amir. Now, I want you to really pay attention to this, because you've got all these things going on. One is that, so over the course of time, an American education in a multicultural, diverse space is going to make people more tolerant, less violent, less aggressive, and more multicultural, right? And of course, it's the Asian kids, right, who get, so he joins the Model Minorities breakdancing group, and now, like, this is a positive move. So you get these whole ways that there's a lot of examples of sort of the similar thing, but you have this sense of what an American education could do, but what it could do is assimilate people. And also, there's very much a sense that culture is a good thing when it's like lightly worn, right? So culture is a thing that we, it's the multicultural food fairs, right? We want to share food. It's great if we learn somebody else's break dancing. But what we don't want to do, as you see, is like be in the political realm. And that's what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. I was going to tell you guys something funny about this too. Oh, this is another thing I just want to make an aside. It's also about assumptions that are made about men too. So this is a time, so first of all, this is a kid who came out of a war zone, right? And he's being read as he's just aggressive, right? Because he's and irreverent and hostile because he's drawing pictures of bombs and planes and other things. Now, as you might recall, across, some of you are too young to really recall this, but across the states after 9/11, lots of kids drew pictures of bombs and guns. Who gets constructed as that being an outcome of like post-traumatic stress disorder, right? That we're in a time where everybody has PTSD. None of the teachers ever talked about any of the Palestinian or Lebanese or other kids who'd come out of war zones as having PTSD. They were just aggressive, right? And violent and hostile. And there were some boys who got actually sent to the discipline office and suspended for drawing pictures of planes going into buildings after 9/11, okay? So those Arab kids are getting constructed right away as being like that they want this, right? And none of the kids I ever worked with were supportive of the attacks, ever, right? But they get imagined to be. There was a teacher who told me a story about how on 9/11, she remembers these girls were eating candy. And later on, she found out that was how people in the Middle East, in Palestine, celebrated when there was suicide bombing. So she realized that they were celebrating. And like, kids ate candy every single day. I mean, like every kid I knew had candy in their pockets all the time. They were sharing candy. But that rereading of all these actions through these lenses was really prominent and was really hard to break through. And even the teacher who had sent the boys to the disciplinary office for drawing those pictures, she said to me a couple years later, I guess what I would do now is I would educate them, right? Teach them, and there's language in, I have the quote in my book, but it's language of like making them human, teaching them to be tolerant. She never questioned herself about her assumptions about what those pictures meant, right? That didn't change. But, maybe I could be a kinder, gentler teacher, a more liberal teacher that would educate them into kind of American liberalism. Okay, so the final thing I want to think about is like, so what are the Palestinian kids doing in the midst of this? How are they negotiating these political conflicts? And what I show is that they really move back and forth between trying to kind of participate in the multicultural salad bowl that teachers talked about, and being skeptical about the political claims that the U.S. is making about liberty and freedom. And one of the places this really comes to a head is around the Pledge of Allegiance every day. So young people are really debating, what do I do? Some are standing and some are not. The Palestinian kids aren't the only kids who are debating whether to stand or not. Lots of the kids from racially minoritized communities did not stand for the pledge. And we can talk about, why that's the case. But the Palestinian kids are kind of trying to decide, do I stand, don't I stand? If I stand, do I talk? And here's how Samira, these were the images, sorry, that they're caught between. Okay, so here's Samira talking about what she does. We're sitting in the auditorium full of Americans in the morning. When we get up and Americans look at us, they're like, oh my God, she's wearing a mendil. That's the word that they used for hijab. And she's standing for our flag. Even though I'm not saying the Pledge of Allegiance, I stand up as a matter of respect towards those people. I love when they look at me, especially those teachers, and they're like, look, she has respect towards herself and others because she's standing up for our flag. So I'm making a place for myself to be visible and part of this multicultural nation. One strategy. But now look at the conflict here. Even though it's my flag too, because I'm living in the United States of America, I don't feel it's my flag, but the truth is you're a US citizen, so it is your flag. I feel like they're pledging for, there are the American troops in Iraq killing Arabs. So when I think about it, it's like me praying for troops to kill more Arabs. That's how I think of pledging the flag. Okay? Those conflicts, those real conflicts that people have about what does this mean, were never able to be visible, right? Those were completely unsayable in a school where kids were basically asked to line up, almost completely unsayable, behind the politics of the nation, right? So there's no, even though we say there's this room for debate, there actually is very little room for debate. And Palestine had a very particular, I mean, we can't talk at length about the politics of Palestine in the US, but there's actually a recent report out from Palestine Legal Foundation about how many people have been disciplined in academia for speaking on behalf of Palestinians. It's actually, including losing jobs, et cetera, it's actually quite intense. But I'm going to tell you, a story about what happened in this school, which is that, so, the only way that we talk about diversity, we can express diversity in most schools is not the political, it's the cultural, right? So we have our multicultural days. And the year that I first became involved with this school, or it was as an outcome of this incident, but there were two multicultural fairs a year there. The first was run by the ESL program, and the second was kind of a big fair for the school. And that year, a number of teachers had come to the administration and demanded that they did not want Palestinian kids at the ESL fair to be able to should display their flag. And so the school said, we're banning all flags, right? Flag, it's a sign, it's a sign of support for terrorism, blah, blah, blah. So that happened, and then the May big affair was happening, and the kids from a bunch of Palestinian kids approached the coordinator of that fair to ask her when it was happening, and they wanted to participate. She said, oh, we're not having that. We're not having one this year. So they show up in May, and guess what? It's Multicultural Fair Day. And they walk into the gym, and there's flags everywhere. And there's a big, there's a table with an Israel table with, a map and flags. And so two of the boys get into a fight with the girls who are in the Israel table. And what their disciplinary report says, they said, and it's interesting, it's like the same quote for both of them. They said, fuck, that's not Israel, that's Palestine. They were held for hate speech. Okay? Now, my point here is not whether that was an accurate statement. The point is that was an educational opportunity, right? That's a political dispute. It's a political dispute that's having enormous consequences, in the Middle East and in other places. And that was a lost opportunity to have a conversation. But again, that's back to that tolerance discourse. So they were expelled following the school's zero tolerance for intolerance policy. And certain kinds of political speech is intolerant and therefore intolerable. Right? Okay, so this is my fast last thing, which is like, what are the implications? And I'd say there are implications for research and education. One is that I think there's been a lot of good work criticizing the limits of multiculturalism, and I think it really those critiques have to be expanded to really focus on questions of nationalism and the United States' role on the global stage. I think we have to, again, instead of taking cultural identities as kind of categories that pre-exist, we have to really analyze the politics of culture talk and the ways that identities get produced in situated contexts. I say to my PhD students all the time, you know this, that I say identity isn't a variable, but we research it often like it's a variable. And I want to raise that question. I think we need more focus on young people's citizenship practices. How are they creating space for themselves in the social, political, and and cultural worlds. And really, I think we need really to think very seriously about developing educators' deep knowledge about the globe. I think that we do not see the rest of the world a lot of the time in this country. It is invisible to us. And I think we need to do that in a way that doesn't just produce, like, global education is about U.S. economic advantage. If you read the DOE's white paper on global education, it's all about what can we do to become more economically competitive. I think that's deeply problematic. And I also think that, you know, we have a lot of transnational communities in our midst, and they're never, I mean, the kids in my study were never, ever asked to be resources to understand the political situation in the Middle East. They knew a lot. They and their families knew a lot. They were following Arab media and other things, and they were never drawn on as they were seen as, you know, like a deep hole. Okay, that's it. That's what I'm here for.